The war in Afghanistan started on December 24, 1979 and ended on February 15, 1989. It involved many groups of Arab Afghan volunteers and received support from the governments of the United States of America, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, Israel, Indonesia, and China. This was the start of a long series of U.S.-led interventions in the area.
This is the start of many long funding programs led by the CIA of the United States of America. These led to the funding of the Wahhabist Arab nationalist era under Osama bin Laden. They received funding mainly from the United States and some oil fields in Saudi Arabia.
This funding was kept secret from the American public, and it became the United Soviet Socialist Republics of Vietnam. The United States funded the Afghan Mujahideen guerrillas with weapons and hard currency. This allowed the Afghan fighters to buy and make weapons across the border in nearby Pakistan. On the other hand, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was supported by the USSR and India. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was formed after the Saur Revolution on April 27, 1978. The government was one with a pro-poor, pro-farmer, and socialist agenda. It had close relationships with the Soviet Union. On December 5, 1978, a friendship treaty was signed with the Soviet Union and the United States. On July 3, 1979, United States President Jimmy Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. The aim of the U.S. was to drag the Soviet Union into the so-called Afghan trap, as United States National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski termed it. Russian military involvement in Afghanistan has had a long history, going back to Tsarist expansions and the so-called Great Game between Russia and Britain. In February 1979, the Islamic Revolution ousted the American Shah from Afghanistan's neighbor Iran. The United States ambassador to Afghanistan was kidnapped by Satami militias and was later killed during an assault carried out by the Afghan police, assisted by Soviet advisors. The death of Ambassador Adolf Dubs led to a major degradation in Afghanistan-United States relations. March 1979 marked the signing of the U.S.-backed peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. The Soviet leadership saw the agreement as a major advantage for the United States. One Soviet newspaper stated that Egypt and Israel were now gendarmes of the Pentagon. The Soviets viewed the treaty not only as a peace agreement between the erstwhile allies in Egypt and U.S.-supported Israelis, but also as a military pact.
In addition, the U.S. sold more than 5,000 missiles to Saudi Arabia and also supplied the royalist rebels in the North Yemen civil war against Nasser's government. This started a history of U.S. interventions in the Middle East. It was also the start of the Bin Laden Conspiracy. King Mohammed Zahir Shah acceded to the throne, reigned from 1933 to 1973. Zahir's cousin, Mohammed Daoud Khan, served as the Prime Minister from 1954 to 1963. The Marxist PDPA party's strength grew considerably in these years. In 1967, the PDPA split into two rival factions, the Khalq. Well, how do you pronounce it?
The Khalq.
The Khalq masses. The Khalq faction, headed by Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin and the Parchan.
Alright, so I'll read this part. Alright. In addition, the U.S. sold more than 5,000 missiles to Saudi Arabia and also supplied the royalist rebels in the North Yemen civil war against the Nasserist government. This started a history of U.S. interventions in the Middle East. It was also the start of the so-called Bin Laden Conspiracy. King Mohammed Zahir Shah ascended to the throne and reigned from 1933 to 1973. Zahir's cousin Mohammed Daoud Khan served as Prime Minister from 1954 to 1963. The Marxist PDPA party's strength grew considerably in these years. In 1967, the PDPA split into two rival factions, the Khalq faction headed by Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hasifullah Zulu Amin, and the Parchan faction led by Barabak Karmal. Former Prime Minister Daoud seized power in a military coup on July 17, 1973. After allegations of corruption and poor economic conditions against the king's government, Daoud put an end to the monarchy, but his time in power was widely unpopular. Its opposition from the PDPA was sparked by the repression imposed on him by Daoud's regime and the death of the leading PAPA member, Mir Akbar Khyber.
The mysterious circumstances of Khyber's death sparked massive anti-Daoud demonstrations in Kabul, which resulted in the arrest of several prominent PDPA leaders. On April 7th, on April 27, 1978, the Afghan army, which had been sympathetic to the PDPA cause, was sparked by we can edit this.
On
April 27, 1978, the Afghan army, which had been sympathetic to the PDPA cause, overthrew and executed Daoud, along with members of his family. Nur Muhammad Taraki, Secretary General of the PDPA, became President of the Revolutionary Council and Prime Minister of the newly established Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. The Afghan government, having secured a treaty in December 1978 that allowed them to call on Soviet forces, repeatedly requested the introduction of troops in Afghanistan in the spring and summer of 1979. They requested Soviet troops to provide security and to assist in the fight against the Mujahideen rebels. On April 14, 1979, the Afghan government requested that the USSR send 15 to 20 helicopters with their crews to Afghanistan, and on June 16th, the Soviet government responded and sent a detachment of tanks, BMPs, and crews to guard the government in Kabul and to secure the Bagram and Shinidad airfields. In response to this request, an airborne battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel A. Lomakin arrived at the Bagram air base on July 7th. They arrived without their combat gear, disguised as technical specialists. They were the personal bodyguards for President Taraki. The paratroopers were directly subordinate to the senior Soviet military advisor and did not interfere in Afghan politics. Several leading politicians at the time, such as Alexei Kosygin and Andrei Gromyko, were against intervention. After a month, the Afghan requests were no longer for individual crews and subunits, but for regiments and larger units. In July, the Afghan government requested that 2 motorized rifle divisions be sent to Afghanistan. The following day, they requested an airborne division in addition to the earlier requests. They repeated these requests and variants to these requests over the following months, right up to December 1979. However, the Soviet government was in no hurry to grant them.
The anti-communist rebels garnered support from the United States. Former CIA Director and previous Secretary of Defense Robert Gates wrote in his memoirs, From the Shadows, that the U.S. intelligence services began to provide financial aid to the rebel faction in Afghanistan. 6 months before the Soviet deployment on July 3, 1979, President Jimmy Carter signed an executive order authorizing the CIA to conduct covert propaganda operations against the communist regime. In 1988 interview with French news magazine Le Nouvel Observateur, Semenegi Brzezinski was quoted as have said, "We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Soviets into the Afghan trap." On July 3, 1979, Carter signed a presidential finding. On July 3, 1979, Carter signed the presidential finding authorizing funding for anti-communist guerrillas in Afghanistan as a part of the Central Intelligence Agency program called Operation Cyclone, led by their Elite Special Activities Division, which would later include the massive arming of Afghanistan's Mujahideen.
Pause between each sentence so we can...
Based on information from the KGB, Soviet leaders felt that Prime Minister Hazavullah Amin's actions had destabilized the situation in Afghanistan. Following his initial coup against President Taraki, the KGB station in Kabul warned Moscow that Amin's leadership would lead to harsh reprisals and, as a result, the activation and consolidation of opposition. The Soviets established a special commission on Afghanistan comprising KGB Cabinet Yuri Andropov, Boris Pananivin from the Central Committee, and Dmitry Ustinov, the Minister of Defense. In late 1978, the committee reported that Amin was purging his opponents, including Soviet loyalists, and that his loyalty to Moscow was in question, and that he was seeking diplomatic links for Pakistan and the People's Republic of China, which at the time had poor relationship with the Soviet Union. In mid-1980s, the Afghan resistance movement, assisted by the United States, Pakistan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and the People's Republic of China, and many others, contributed to Moscow's high military costs and strained international relations.
The U.S. viewed the conflict in Afghanistan as an integral Cold War struggle, and the CIA provided assistance to anti-Soviet forces through the Pakistani intelligence services in a program called Operation Cyclone. A similar movement occurred in other Muslim countries, bringing contingents of so-called Afghan Arabs, foreign fighters who wished to wage jihad against the atheist communists. Notable among them was a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, whose Arab group eventually evolved into Al-Qaeda. The arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev on the scene in 1985 and his new thinking on foreign and domestic policy was probably the most important factor in the Soviets' decision to leave. Gorbachev was attempting to change the stagnant years of Brezhnev and reform the Soviet Union's economy and image across the board with the glasnost and perestroika. Gorbachev was also trying to seize the Cold War tensions by signing the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987 with the U.S. and withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan, whose presence had gathered so much international commendation. The Civil War continued in Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal. The Soviet Union left Afghanistan deep in winter with intimations of panic among Kabul officials. The Afghan Mujahideen were poised to attack provincial towns and cities, and eventually Kabul if necessary.
Najibullah's regime, although failing to win popular support, territorial, or international recognition, was, however, able to remain in power until 1992. Ironically, until demoralized by the defections of its senior officers, the Afghan army had achieved a level of performance it had never reached under direct Soviet tutelage. Kabul had achieved a stalemate that exposed the Mujahideen's weaknesses politically and militarily, but for nearly 3 years while Najibullah's government successfully defended itself against Mujahideen attacks, factions within the government had also developed connections with its opponents. The Islamists also believed that they were responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden, for example, was asserting the credit for the dissolution of the Soviet Union goes to God and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
Duma member Semyon Bagdasarov Duma member Semyon Bagdasarov advocated that Russia had to reject Western calls for stronger assistance to the U.S.-led ISAF coalition in Afghanistan, and also had to establish contacts with the anti-Western forces, such as the Taliban, in case they regain power. This means that U.S. intervention in the region was all a plot to double-cross Osama bin Laden, and they let the Taliban take over the country. In short, the Taliban received all of their funding from the U.S., and then we suddenly left them on their own. This caused many normal, peaceful Afghans to turn against us. This government conspiracy caused the current war in Afghanistan.
This ends our current report. Allah May Allah enlighten us all.
Woo! 14 minutes.